Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, that's CASAC, says implementing the recommendations of Zondo's state capture report should top our national agenda. Today is 1 year since Chief Justice Raymond Zondo delivered the report. CASAC says while the president has submitted an implementation plan, 1 year on, too little has been done. Let's speak now to CASAC's Executive Secretary, Lawson Naidoo. Lawson, good afternoon. Welcome to today, and thank you very much for your time. 1 year on, very little has happened. No real consequence to any of the individuals who were implicated in that state capture report in one or other form of wrongdoing. I mean, that's very disappointing.
Indeed. Good afternoon, Dan. Thank you very much. It is indeed, but I think we must separate the recommendations that emanate from the State Capture Commission of Inquiry into perhaps two categories. Those that reflect on the conduct of a whole list of individuals where further investigation and prosecution has been recommended. And we know that some progress has been made in that regard with the establishment of the investigating directorate. The progress has been far too slow, however, and we would certainly hope that the investigations and prosecutions and the enrolling of cases against those implicated will be speeded up in the coming months. But I think the real concern that CASAC and PARI have expressed in the statement a year to the day since the report was handed to President Ramaphosa is that from a government perspective, there's been far too little action or steps taken to implement the recommendations. As we point out, the President responded to Parliament in October last year, setting out government's implementation plan, a fairly detailed plan that was set out to the nation. But the actual steps to implement those points that were laid out by President Ramaphosa have been exceedingly slow. And the failure to implement is not without its consequences. Just today, we see news reports of yet another whistleblower in the city of Johannesburg, who has allegedly been fired for blowing the whistle on over 8 billion rands worth of corruption in the public safety department.
Sarika Lakraj.
That's correct, Dan. So, you know, the failure to implement has consequences because whistleblowers continue to be victimized. One of the key recommendations from Chief Justice Zondo in his report was additional protection for whistleblowers. And this is something that government itself in its response last year said that they would prioritize, but we haven't seen the action that is necessary. So whistleblowers continue to be extremely vulnerable and, get targeted.
Yeah. The other point you make in your statement, which I think is important, is about the recommendation that have come out for the National Assembly, to make some changes. And they needed to adopt some of these key recommendations will enable and improve the oversight function of the National Assembly. But nothing has happened there.
Well, similarly with government's response, Parliament then submitted its own response, a formal response, which was tabled in Parliament in January this year, I think, and set out again a very detailed process of how they would deal with the implementation, both by monitoring what government does and also addressing the recommendations that were directed at Parliament itself. But once again, progress has been incredibly slow. Just as one example, to say that there was a recommendation that a dedicated committee be established to oversee the presidency. The can has been kicked down the road on that, and all that Parliament has now agreed is that they're going to conduct a study visit to the UK and France to see how things are done there. Well, there's not much point going to the UK because they don't have a president. So I'm not sure what the worth of such a visit would be. And it seems to be, fairly straightforward that such a committee needs to be established. It would demonstrate Parliament's commitment to taking the Zondo report seriously and to dealing with its recommendations. But again, we see no sense of urgency in implementing these recommendations. There have, however, I must say, been some progress in the rehabilitation of state institutions. One thinks of SARS, the NPA, the Hawks, and some of the state-owned companies. But again, this progress has been far too slow and does not get the priority attention that we believe it deserves.
And as time moves on, I mean, most of the stuff that came out of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry related to things that happened in the past, you know, some years ago. And we're sitting here 1 year on after the report was completed and handed over with a series of recommendations. Nothing has happened. And as time proceeds and nothing happens, there's a likelihood that nothing will happen.
Well, you know, that's a real danger, Dan, and I think something that's civil society organizations in particular are acutely aware of. And that's why, you know, civil society has once again been at the forefront of continuously raising these issues, highlighting the recommendations that need to be implemented, and urging government to do the right thing. You know, this report of the Zondo Commission, which was 4 years in the making, was a damning indictment on the state of democracy in South Africa, how institutions had been weakened, how rampant looting was allowed to take place, and we seem to not deal with that with any sense of urgency. That there's a real need to fix institutions of governance and the way that we handle, in particular, law enforcement issues. But that urgency has been sadly lacking, and what we see on a daily basis are more and more revelations of corruption continuing to happen across various sectors within our society.
Yeah, because unless the recommendations of the commissions are implemented, there won't be real change. I mean, and then we'd look back and say 1 billion rand or so was spent on this, and it was all in vain.
Well, I don't think it was in vain because, you know, if nothing else, the Zondo Commission has given us a huge body of evidence and information that is going to be useful for law enforcement agencies. And we need to make sure that those agencies utilize that information, conduct further investigations with a view to prosecuting those implicated. So, you know, I certainly don't think that, although R1 billion is a large sum of money, when we look at in the bigger scheme of things, of the many hundreds of billions that were stolen, you know, it's probably money well worth spent. But the real value of that time and effort that was expended will be in ensuring that there is accountability for those who did wrong and the instruction to fix the institutions that were broken during the process of state capture.
Yeah, Lawson, what would need to change now? What would need to happen, in your view, from a civil society perspective, to put pressure on the system, to give the leadership a sense of urgency around getting somewhere with the recommendations, moving the needle?
Well, I think, you know, civil society has certainly played its role. You know, there have been various discussions, conferences and workshops that have been held, looking and unpacking not just the report, but its recommendations in some detail, and making proposals as to how some of those recommendations could be sharpened, how they could be implemented more quickly, and really giving a steer to government as to how to go about implementing these recommendations. But again, you know, the progress has been very slow. Government keeps repeating its commitments to fixing things, but the action, you know, seems to be way behind. Just as another example, Dan, the president committed to establishing the investigating directorate in the NPA as a permanent structure. You know, 8-9 months after he made that commitment, we've yet to see legislation introduced in Parliament to give effect to that promise.
And with the elections coming up next year, I don't know when Parliament will wrap up. We don't know the date yet. The likelihood of that not happening is high.
Well, indeed, you know, we've probably got about a year, maybe just over a year before the elections next year. Parliament is on recess at the moment. They come back and, you know, there's the last quarter of this year. And next year, we know there'll be a very curtailed parliamentary program. So a legislative process in Parliament will take a long time. And whether any of these legislative proposals are actually passed and finalized before the 6th Parliament rises seems increasingly unlikely.
Yeah, let's bring it closer home to you as we conclude our chat, Lawson. KSAC, what are you on your part going to be doing into this coming year as a way of supporting all the efforts and initiatives to see the recommendations, both in government and in National Assembly, coming to light, being implemented?
Yeah. Well, CASAC and Parry hosted a conference on the outcomes of the Zondo Commission in September last year, and we are planning a follow-up conference later this year, probably in October, to really look at government's implementation plan, Parliament's implementation plan, to assess what has been done, what remains to be done, and what those priorities ought to be, and to ensure that we mobilize the broader civil society collective around maintaining this pressure, because I think we cannot afford to lose sight of the lessons learned through the Zondo Commission and make sure that those are implemented. Whether it happens now or in a few months' time, that pressure has got to be kept on, because we cannot allow government to get away with once again not implementing recommendations that emanate from a Commission of Inquiry.
Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Lawson Naidoo, the Executive Secretary of CASAC.